Hi, and welcome to the Polite Society Podcast interview segment. We're coming at you from the Mag 40. We are recording on the end of day 2 of Mag 40 at the Del Rapids Sportsman's Club in Del Rapids, South Dakota. I want to thank Gail and Mass for agreeing to do an interview with us. Gary's here with us, Rachel's with us, and Matt from Geeks, Gadgets, and Guns is sitting in with us. I really shouldn't need to introduce Massad Ayoob and Gail Pepin. Everybody should know who they are, but if somebody just crawled out of a rock after 30 years and is just listening to their first pro-gun podcast, Massad Ayoob, I consider the top #1 national level firearms trainer. He's been training since the early 70s. He's written numerous books, starting with the seminal book of the handgun defense world,
In the Gravest Extreme.
Thank you. In the Gravest Extreme. Came out in 1980 and has written many, many books since then. Is again, my opinion, the world's top handgun trainer. Also joining us, Gail Pepin. Gail is the Georgia, Florida IDPA champion in the women's division.
Okay.
She is also part of the Massad Ayoob group. She is a champion level shooter in her own respect. I want to thank you both for agreeing to sit down and join us.
Don't forget him, the Predator at the ProArms Podcast.
You certainly are. The editor, producer, which when you combine them and switch them around becomes Predator.
Predator. Yes.
Well, that too.
So I'm going to go ahead and, as soon as I get my notes back up here, there's a couple things I want to discuss right off the top. Mass, I wanted to ask you. You are, again, my opinion, the firearm trainer, and can't think of anybody more qualified to ask. When Massad Ayoob looks to get training for firearms, what do you look for in a trainer? What makes a good firearm trainer for you?
They're easier to find today in the age of the internet and the AARs, the after-action reports. Basically, we've got more fine firearms instructors than we've ever had. When I got into this as a young kid, there was really nothing available outside the police academy or the military context. The civilian could go to Camp Perry every year at the National NRA Pistol Championships and get some good tutoring on how to shoot a bullseye match, and that was about it. Mid-1970s, Jeff Cooper established Gunsight, the American Pistol Institute. Ray Chapman established the Chapman Academy. And really, in the last 35 years, it's become a cottage industry. We have now people coming back from the sandbox who are teaching with lots of combat experience. And we have more available to the private citizen in terms of quality training ranging from basic firearms to competition, to defensive use of the assorted firearms, to the legal side of it that we concentrate on, than has ever been available. Basically, check the internet. Any instructor you're looking at, get a copy of their resume and check it for what it was designed for. The resume shouldn't be a brag sheet. It should be a consumer's guide to track this thing, go to the sources, see if the instructor is who he says he is, if he's done what he says he's done.
Very cool. Anybody else want to add to that? Any thoughts anybody wants to add in there? Boy, I'm getting crickets on that. We better move on to the next one. Next question I had for you, Mass. I know you cover this in the Mag 40. As a matter of fact, it got covered a little bit today in Mag 40. But I've always been a proponent of, if you need to shoot your gun, forgive but your first warning shot to be the center of mass. I know, but
I don't take it personal.
Yeah. I want to know what your thought is on warning shots. There's two groups of thoughts. First one is, of course, the mind that you never ever shoot one, but the other one is that they can be a defensive warning for before you have to take the final fatal shot. What do you think?
Well, it's generally not a good idea to fire warning shots for many reasons. First, firing in the proximity or general direction of any individual is an indication of hostile intent and can be construed as an act of lethal force in and of itself. If the situation was low level enough that you could get by with a warning shot, then by your own lights, you're saying this was not yet a killing situation. If you are the one who started the shooting, this is not going to put you in the best possible light later in criminal or civil court. We recommend against it for the same reason police in America almost universally avoid the warning shot. It creates the false illusion in the minds of every ear witness and even some eyewitnesses that you're trying to kill someone that you're not in fact attempting to kill. To do it safely, we're launching a lethal projectile here. We've got to see visually that it's going into something that can safely absorb the projectile. And if it becomes an issue later, if other people are shooting and it's a question of who shot who, can retrievably absorb that projectile. You fired the warning shot over the head, let's say, of the fellow who's running down the street and takes a right and goes out of your sight around the corner. You hear another gunshot, you come around the corner and here's the guy laying here dead and somebody else is standing over him with a smoking gun. There's a bullet hole through and through him, no bullet to recover. And the other guy who fired realizes, oh heck, I was out of bounds. And he says, no, I fired a warning shot. That other guy who was chasing him shot him and then he ran around the corner and fell dead. You've got some pretty serious problems here. There is always the possibility that the warning shot can cause the weapon to malfunction. You know, Murphy's Law, it'll malfunction at the worst possible time. If we have not taken our eyes off the offender to place that bullet someplace safe and retrievable, we can end up like the case a few years ago in Ohio where the guy fired the shot into the air, it came down, killed a 15-year-old kid. We had one in New England several years ago. The guy fires upward into the air, and a shot struck and killed an innocent bystander who was standing on an upper floor porch of an apartment building. If this guy's not dangerous enough for you to have to keep your eye on him, he's certainly not dangerous enough for you to be starting gunfire. So for all these reasons, we strongly recommend against the warning shot.
So I noticed that Florida, where you're living now, has been, I've heard some conversation about making a warning shot legal or something like that, right? Did I hear that right? So isn't that going to lead to more confusion with the civilians?
The warning shot per se has never been illegal in and of itself. Each situation is judged within the totality of the circumstances. The Florida legislation came out of a situation in Jacksonville, Florida, where an allegedly battered woman fired a shot above the individual who was threatening her and was prosecuted by Angela Corey for aggravated assault, attempted murder, and mopery with intent to gawk. And she wound up being kind of like George Zimmerman, a classic example of overcharging and wrongful prosecution. There was great outrage over that, not only in the African American community, but really throughout the entire state. So I think people were trying to put in a cushion there that might make things safer, but it may not have been the best thought out piece of self-defense legislation that ever went to a state house.
Right, but so yeah, we agree it's not a good idea, but is that going to end up leading to confusion on the part of the concealed carriers in Florida?
It can. When you have a newspaper headline or a newspaper editorial that just has a capsule description of the legislation that happened, it leads to confusion on all sides. We saw this classically years ago when Florida passed the 776 package of legislation that became known as the Stand Your Ground law. Now, the actual Stand Your Ground portion of the 776 series was simply a rescinding of the retreat requirement. Prior to that, if you were attacked in a public place, you were expected to make some attempt to retreat if you could safely do so before you resorted to the use of deadly force. Then in Florida, and even now in the states that still have the retreat requirement, if you read the fine print, the retreat is only demanded if it can be accomplished in complete safety to oneself and others. And if you think about it, if any of us were in a situation where we could have extricated ourselves in complete safety to ourselves and others, why would we have started shooting in the first place?
Right.
But what that did do was clarify things. It made it clearer to the general public, the jury pool, that you don't have to climb out a window and turn your back to the home invader with a knife. It also gave prosecutors a face-saving way out when there was political pressure on them in a politically incorrect shooting, to prosecute the shooter. It allowed them to say, look, this law says what he did was legal. Part of my fiduciary responsibility to the taxpayers and the public is to not waste their money on very expensive prosecutions of cases that can't be won. And for that reason, we're not going to prosecute. And that stopped a whole lot of cases that otherwise would have been unmeritorious political prosecutions. Unfortunately, that particular legislative package was a reform package that included other elements. It included a tort reform element that said if it has been determined that your shooting was self-defense by the criminal justice system, that can be introduced in a hearing at the beginning of any civil lawsuit against you over the same incident. And the judge, based on that, can kill the case and dismiss the lawsuit against you. Nobody is going to take that much time to explain that in a newspaper editorial, in a 30-second news blurb, or something like that. And we had the general public, not only the jury pool, but God help us, our fellow gun owners, took this as saying, if I say I shot him in self-defense, I can't be sued. That's not what it says at all. That the fuzzy words there, has been determined to be self-defense, means basically it's gone in front of a judge in a 776032 hearing, in which the judge has reviewed all the evidence and in essence, in a mini bench trial, has said, look, the evidence shows me that to a preponderance of evidence, this was self-defense. And at that point, the judge has the option, not the requirement, but the option of killing the case there. If the prosecutor has issued what's called a memorandum of closure, which expressly states, not just we're not prosecuting this person for this, but we have investigated this case and determined it to be self-defense, that basically fulfills the requirement of 776032. And it's like a stake in the heart of the vampire as far as a false lawsuit.
Right.
But a whole lot of people seem to think, gosh, a good shoot is a good shoot. If I think it's a good shoot, the whole world must think it's a good shoot, and the law must have declared it to be a good shoot. And whenever I hear that, I think, yeah, and on the night of December 24th, a little fat dude in a red suit's going to come down your chimney and give you some presents, too. It don't work that easy, sports fans.
I would like to remind everybody in the room here, and for the listeners and viewers on YouTube, we do have about a third of the class that we finished up day 2. About a third of the class stayed around to hang out. We're going to be having pizza here in a few minutes when it shows up. But if you have any questions, go ahead and step up to the green microphone, and you can certainly ask your questions. Before we go on to that, though, Mass, I want to go to a podcast that you folks released just about a year ago, last summer. On it, Mass, you interviewed a Skokie, Illinois police officer about a shooting. And one thing there were 2 things about that shooting that caught my attention. First of all, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed to me that he said, because it's been a long while since I listened to the show, that particular show, it's like a 4 to 5 minute response time, even for a police officer in trouble, for another officer to show up. Am I remembering that right?
I would have to go back and check the exact time, but from the beginning of the gunfight to the last shot fired was determined to have been approximately 54 seconds. The shooting evolved out of the officer's high-speed pursuit of a known bank robber who was known to be heavily armed. He was the only officer behind him, and the guy apparently figured out, if I can kill this cop, I may be able to get out of here scot-free. He hit the binders, slammed on his brakes. Action beats reaction. By the time the officer has stopped to avoid a collision, he's already out of the car, running toward him, shooting. Sergeant Grammons, Tim Grammons was the involved officer, returned fire through the windshield. The fight went on. He exited the vehicle as the other man ran back to his car for another gun. And as the shootout continued throughout most of a minute, Tim had to reload his Glock 21 pistol twice. Probably on the order of 50-some rounds were fired in those 53, 54 seconds. He hit the suspect, I believe, 17 times, including twice in the head, but none of the headshots had pierced the brain. He hit darn near every vital organ in the guy's torso with 45 caliber 230 grain gold dots, including the heart. But you have to remember the heart is the strongest muscle on the body. It's a system of valves and chambers, and it seals itself like a tubeless tire. And the heart shot is not necessarily an instant one-shot stop. This guy was up and running and shooting at the officer right up until the officer's final shot, which found the brain and ended the fight.
Well, a couple things that says to me is, specifically about that is, a 45 is not an instant death ray.
No firearm is an instant death ray.
And the other thing that it says to me is it's important to have a spare magazine, at least one. Anyway, one more thing here before we go off to break. The other episode from ProArms Podcast that still sticks in my mind is and this has been a couple of years ago, this one was released, there was an incident in Ohio where there was a private zoo or a private wildlife refuge, and the owner of the wildlife refuge decided to commit suicide, but before he did, he released a bunch of dangerous animals. The police then, of course, had to go clean up the mess, round up the dangerous animals, and there was a one-shot stop of a bear with a handgun.
With a 40 caliber pistol.
That a bear. I mean, I would think in the wild, the Alaska, you got people carrying 10. You got people 454 Casull, 10 millimeter. The really big handguns, and yet the much maligned by Chaz of the Road Gunner podcast 40 did a one-shot stop on a bear. Is there anything about that whole incident besides that one-shot stop? What sticks out for you about that incident?
Really, the fact that it was extremely painful for the officers. Folks were saying, particularly big game hunters and stuff, wow, if only I could be lucky enough to be a cop there, and instead of $80,000 for a shikari in India to shoot a tiger or a safari in Alaska to shoot a lion, wow, they pay me to go out and shoot lion after lion, tiger after tiger, woot! And every single one of the officers we talked to that was involved in that talked about the personal grief they felt having to put down those beautiful animals. None of it was about sport, none of it was about machismo. It was protecting the community from what they knew to be not the malicious bipeds that they dealt with every day, but animals that were simply following their nature and through no fault of their own had to be destroyed. And those officers actually found it extremely traumatic. And I think therein lies much more of the story than what you saw in the newspapers about the incident.
Well, we do have to run off to break. We will be right back. We're going to do one more segment with Mass and Gail, and we'll be right back right after this. And we're back with segment 2 with Massad Ayoob and Gail Pepin of the Massad Ayoob group, and we're at day 2 of Mag 40 in Del Rapids, South Dakota. I'm used to saying Sioux Falls because that's where I'm from. Rachel, you had a question you wanted to lead in with.
I sure do. I have a question about the law. So we've obviously been talking a lot about the law, and as much as I've researched and studied already, I've learned so much more. Particularly, I was fascinated by how you were telling us we can go into legal libraries and where we can find sources. So could you just pontificate for a minute on the sources of law for a layperson, what to even look for, and then how we can interpret it to be useful?
Sure, but be planning on spending some time in a legal library. As we said in class, the general public seems to think that legal libraries are only for attorneys and law students, but that's only true of the libraries that are in the law firms, in the law schools. Basically, every county seat somewhere either in the county courthouse or very near it is going to be a county legal library that you guys and gals tax money paid for and is absolutely open to you. And it's been my experience the legal librarians in there will just bend over backwards for somebody who came in not because, oh crap, I just got nailed in a small claims court thing, you know, but who want to learn the law. They will bend over backwards to help you find it. We suggest that you start with what's called colloquially the black letter law, the state statutes and the criminal codes or penal codes. Progress from there into the relevant case law that some of that material will guide you to. And the legal librarians will show you how to look that up. Be looking for the CJS, the Corpus Juris Secundum. The CJS, Corpus Juris Secundum translates as the body of the law. It's kind of a reasonably simplified explanation of various legal principles. Go from there to ask the legal librarian about your state's recommended jury instructions. Those are about the clearest definitions you're going to find of how your state's law and case law applies to the various elements. You want to be looking at homicide, assault, weapons, and you want to be looking at some of the subtleties of deadly force law, concepts like the doctrine of competing harms, for example, as it applies to this, sometimes called the doctrine of necessity or the doctrine of two evils. You want to be looking at disparity of force. Disparity of force is something that comes up very commonly in private citizen self-defense. And what it means essentially is your opponent is not armed with a per se weapon, the knife, the club, whatever. But his physical size and strength advantage over you, his known or obviously inferable skill advantage over you, his and his friends' force of numbers advantage over you is so great and is so likely to cause death or crippling injury that it becomes the equivalent of a deadly weapon, and it warrants your recourse to a deadly weapon in self-defense. I have met attorneys who graduated law school and passed a bar exam who did not know there was such a thing as disparity of force. It is absolutely critical for the person carrying a gun, the person teaching self-defense to know that sort of thing.
Well, I can say I grew up knowing about disparity of force.
That's because for those of you listening to this on audio and not on video, the last time I saw anything as big as my brother here was coming up out of Tokyo Harbor and was attacking the city.
Exactly. Gail, you travel around with Mass on most of these trips, I assume. I mean, every time I see you. What is the best question you've ever heard asked during one of these classes? Anything just that stands out like, oh my God, that was never been asked before, or something like that? Anything?
Nothing really comes to mind. Kind of, I hear the same questions asked over and over.
Okay, so what's the most important one you hear asked over and over?
I think the most important one would be, why hasn't someone gotten Gail a Jim Beam on the rocks?
Probably because I'm the designated driver.
I love that about you.
We get a lot of questions about hand loads. I think there's a lot about that, a lot of confusion about that. And I shouldn't even go there because that's... we get a lot of questions about firearm selection.
Yeah.
That's it, firearm selection. Should I get a Glock or a Springfield? And
How about both?
Yeah, how about both? Some people have those old guns with the things that flip up on the side and they only hold like 8 or 9 rounds. What do you call those? They're made of metal, all metal. That's like a 19 something.
Yeah.
And so it begins.
Yeah, so I think you've just encouraged thousands of emails for you guys to deal with.
Some people like those primitive guns.
I love those primitive guns. Unfortunately, now they make them in 15-round capacity.
Ooh.
15-round capacity and 100-year-old technology. There we go.
That's
Way
right.
to go.
We do have questions from the audience. Go ahead and step up to the mic, get real close, and introduce yourself, and then go ahead and ask.
My name is Pat. I'm from Minneapolis, and a lot of times you see the stories in the paper, and he was shot 18 times or 12 times or whatever. And I guess I'd like to hear more about, they say a one-shot stop, but there's what I've heard called the dead man's 10 seconds, where just because you've been hit with a fatal shot doesn't mean that you're not able to fight back.
Now, that happens frequently. We do get one-shot stops. They're actually fairly frequent. But the human body is a tremendously resilient thing. The TV media and the paperback novels and stuff would have you believe if you shoot a guy in the heart, he instantly collapses. And occasionally that will occur. Occasionally it won't. The literature of the journals of trauma is replete with people who've taken pistol wounds to the heart and survived. As we said, it's a system of valves and chambers. It seals itself. And any MD who has worked with cardiac patients can tell you people who have walked into the ER on their own 2 feet, said, "Hey doc, my chest really hurts." They find out half the guy's heart muscle is dead, and he's still walking, talking, and doing purposeful physical activity. Now, even if you fired a shotgun blast that shredded the guy's heart and totally stopped cardiac function, if his brain is fully oxygenated, he's got a good 15, 16 seconds left of conscious, purposeful physical activity before his brain doesn't have enough oxygen to sustain consciousness. You combine that on both sides of the fight with the fact that with a short reset gun like most semi-automatic pistols or an AR-15, for example, the average person, not necessarily a great champion like Latham or Michalak, but the average person can fire 5 shots per second. You figure if the body is going to keel over and collapse, it takes a good second for it to fall. Now we've got reaction time. The person who's firing the gun is firing desperately to save his life. They have to cognitively process the fact that the other man has turned away, has fallen, has dropped his gun, whatever, and get the message from brain to finger, hey, you know what, we're not in danger anymore, we can stop now. And the time it takes for that to happen. People think of reaction time in frames of reaction to anticipated stimulus, your typical reaction time test. What we're dealing with here is reaction to an unanticipated stimulus, and you have to go through the whole OODA loop of observe what's happening, orient what it means, decide what it means we have to do, and finally act, the physical change in activity that's going to get the finger off the trigger. By the time you've done that, probably a good 1 or 2 or 3 shots have been fired. Now, from the first time you tell what happened, it takes longer to explain it than it took for it to happen. And now over the days, the weeks, the months, sometimes the years that it takes these things to come to trial. When it's in court now and those few seconds are being rehashed day after day, it creates the false illusion in everyone's mind that it happened in slow motion and you had all kinds of time to analyze and decide and do something less harmful and kinder and gentler. And this is one of the things all of us need to understand, need to bring to the table if we're ever picked for jury duty on it, need to be able to testify to if we ever go into court to speak as material witnesses for those we've trained in self-defense.
All right, cool. We got one more question, at least from the audience. Go ahead and introduce yourself and ask your question.
Hi guys, thanks for having me. This is Clayton from an undisclosed location in Minnesota. My question is mostly directed at Mass, since he's had a large chunk of his career through before I've even been born. But as a new up-and-coming instructor, I've been certified with the USCCA since December of 2014, so I've got a little bit of time in. All of my students have been really satisfied with the course I've put out. The USCCA has a similar philosophy that you guys here at Mag 40 do. I'm wondering if you have any advice for trying to grow my customer base and just trying to get the word out, because in Minnesota we have a comparatively small amount of permit carriers to someplace like South Dakota, for example.
Well, be active within the shooting community. If there are gun owners, civil rights rallies, attend. I don't know about you, but I want to take my training from people who believe as I believe, and people who aren't just in it for the money. They're in the fight for our civil rights to protect ourselves, our human rights to protect ourselves, and those of our children. Keep reaching out and doing training yourself. basic rule of life I figured out early. If you don't read, you can't write. If you don't learn, you can't teach. And you being here tells me that you already know that part and you don't need my advice on it.
I have a question for Gail.
Okay.
Unless you have a follow-up, really good. All right, I have a question for Gail. So, Gail, I love seeing you on the range. You're a great range officer, and I love the way you coach the shooters also.
Well, thank you.
So thanks for being there.
Thank you.
Do you have any tips on how we can improve our coaching abilities?
Well, I try to watch everything the shooter does. I'm not watching the target, I'm watching the shooter, I'm watching the gun, making sure they're safe, looking for what they're doing, how they're standing, where they're putting their feet, where they're putting their hands, if they're looking at their sights. Sometimes they're not even looking at their sights. Just kind of observing them, and I try to give them friendly reminders. If they're not, if they're not unsafe, I try to be as encouraging as possible, and I try to say, not this is the way we do it. Say maybe you should try it like this, or maybe you should try it like that. Kind of give suggestions rather than being very dictatorial. So that's kind of where I'm coming from, and usually people respond to that. Not always, but usually.
What factors do you like to see in students, or what do you think makes a good student?
I think a good student is one who comes to a class with an open mind and ready to learn what that instructor is teaching. You don't come to a class saying, well, this is the way I shoot and this is the way I've always done it. And I always want to say, well, then why are you here? Because you already know it all. Why are you taking the class? There's a few, not many, but a few people who kind of come to class to show how cool they are. But, I take a lot of classes. So far this year, it's only the beginning of May, and I have over 80 hours of classes I've taken. So, and when I take a class, I drink the Kool-Aid, I do what they're telling me, because I think you can learn from everybody and anybody, even if you're learning what not to do. You can learn from everybody. And, I never say this is the way I do it. I really try to do it their way. Sometimes, you default to your old habits, but I make an effort to learn their way and their philosophy and see what I can get from them.
I just want to point something out. I want to reiterate. Gail Pepin, as accomplished as you are, has already taken in May 80 hours of instruction, not Massad Ayoob group instruction, instruction from other people that she's taken to improve herself. I think that's amazing.
Well, thank you. I think if you don't keep learning, you don't learn new techniques to give to your students. And if you don't keep learning, you don't grow.
Very cool. We got one more question from the audience. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Jerry from Twin Cities, Minnesota. I got a question for Mass about the Armed Citizens Legal Defense Network, and if I remember, you're one of the founders of that, and the almost industry that's kind of sprung up around the self-defense insurances, as it were. I was just kind of wondering what your opinion on all of them were. If you think there's some that are better than others, or they're all pretty equal, or what do you think?
Well, I wasn't a founder of ACLDN. The founder was Marty Hayes and his wife Gila Hayes and Vincent Schock. I've been on the advisory board from the beginning and function in a training function, and I'm available for the expert witness side of it. Because of that involvement, it would be a conflict of interest for me to compare it to other post-self-defense plans, just as I think it'd be a conflict of interest to ask any instructor, gee, what do you think of the other guy's school? So
Right.
I'm afraid I'd have to pass on that.
No, that's fair enough.
Can I just add one thing on the website for the Armed Citizens Legal Defense Network? And I was trying to look it up, I couldn't find it fast enough. Marty Hayes does a comparison of the different plans, and he kind of breaks down as much as he can the different plans in comparison to the Armed Citizens Legal Defense Network. Obviously, I'm affiliated with them also, and I think, well, they were the first, really.
Yeah.
Everybody else has just been copying them. So I would check out what Marty's written. It may be a couple of years old. It may be a little bit dated. I think some of the plans have changed since then. I haven't read it for a while. He may have updated it, but check it on their website.
All right, cool, thanks.
I want to add something really quick, if I could, as my personal testimony. As my listeners know, there was an incident in February, and I was not a member of the Armed Citizens Legal Defense Network at the time. I wish I was. It has quite literally cost me tens of thousands of dollars. I don't care if it's ACLDN or if it's USCCA, if it's wherever it is. If you carry a gun for self-defense, be covered somewhere. Marty Hayes, Gila Hayes, the folks over at ACLDN reached out to me and have been in every way except financially, which they cannot legally do. Despite the fact that at the time I wasn't a member, they're still offering me support in every way they can. I will continue to endorse them myself, Paul Lathrop, for as long as I can draw a breath. We got one more question.
All right, we're gonna let Clayton ask one more question as long as he keeps sending the emails to the show. Yes. Otherwise, we'll back him off and it'll be emails only for him from now on.
1 second before you go, I found the website. It's armedcitizensnetwork.org/buyer's guide.
Yeah, I figured you guys got bored of all my messages in Facebook,
No,
so I
love
decided
'em.
to stalk you over here in South Dakota instead, see you face to face. I had a question for anybody who wants to answer it. Do you have any advice to try to convince people who are close to you to actually get training? We're all in concurrence that everyone needs training, but so many people just won't dedicate the time and the resources to it.
I can start that. Everybody knows Sherry. I've talked about her on the show before. And grew up in very gun-unfriendly Illinois, in very gun-unfriendly Cook County, in a very gun-unfriendly house. So it was completely new to her until her and I started dating just recently, a few years ago. And you have to approach it like a scared cat that you found on the street. They've been beaten the wrong way for so long. And you have to approach it very, very gently. We touched guns in the living room several times before we even started making noise with them. You know what I mean? And then when we finally did go to the range, it was a quiet range, 22s, couple of times. And as soon as she was ready to go, we left. Come on, let's shoot some more. You know what I mean? So it's all... It depends on the person, obviously, but she came from such a bad place initially that it just takes time and gentle patience. Most trainers will tell you that you shouldn't train your boyfriend, girlfriend. I've been teaching, I started out teaching motorcycles and ATVs 15 years ago, so the sporting instruction I've been doing for quite a while, and we have a great relationship, so I was able to cross that barrier that a lot of instructors won't. So it might be get somebody else to talk to them. If it's not jiving when you're talking to someone that's close to you, it might be time for them to see someone else training. If it's a female, there's lots of groups out there. There's a Girl and a Gun, there's Well-Armed Woman. They have meetings where it's just talking about fashion, gun fashion and stuff, and talking about self-defense.
How do you know what they talk about?
Girl and a Gun has meetings where they actually shoot.
Well, no, I appreciate that, but the one that Sherry goes to, they meet for an hour and then they shoot for an hour. Okay. So if she just wants to go shoot, or just go for the meeting for the hour, whatever it takes to ease into it.
And
I don't know.
I want to point out that out of 22 students in the class, Sherry is one of only 3 women. So Gary must have been doing something really well. And yeah, that's great advice. Phenomenal advice.
She's doing very well.
Yeah. She's here.
Right, with a
She wants
revolver.
more training,
Yeah, she's
right?
the only revolver student.
Yeah.
Right.
That's a real primitive gun.
Wow. Are there any that you like that don't start with G?
Yeah, but they're all made of plastic.
All right, we're fast running out of time, but I do want to thank you folks for joining us again today. And thank you for coming out to South Dakota to put this training on. It's been a phenomenal 2 days already. I know it's going to be another 2 phenomenal days. And just to both of you, thank you for coming out.
Well, it's been our pleasure, Paul. You and your lovely wife have been wonderful host and hostess.
Yes, you have, but could you have done something better about the weather?
Sorry, I put my order in, but apparently it was back ordered.
It's May, it's 40 degrees.
Yeah, we've got freeze warnings. Normal highs in this time of year are the low 70s. 68 to about 72 for this time of year is about normal. Today's high was in the 40s, and we have a freeze warning for tonight. Mother Nature doesn't like me.
Mass is going to start thinking it's me. Last time he trained me at a Mag 40, we had sideways sleet in Illinois in May.
Yes,
was it April or May? It was
horrible.
It was, yes, yeah. So every time he comes to train me, it's nasty weather, so I'm sorry.
I think your new nickname is the Iceman.
He's given me several already in 2 days, so I'll add that to the list.
All right, we do need to head to break. We'll get to DGUs when we get back, and we'll do those right after this. Hey, and welcome back. We were going to be going to DGUs, but Mass and Gail graciously decided that they were going to answer a few more questions, as well as we had more questions immediately pop up as soon as we went to break, and we should have got that on the air. So we're back for a third segment with Massad Ayoob, Gail, Pepin, and where did we want to start? Well, let's go back, Gail, to start with, talking about getting people that are maybe a little hesitant to get into the gun world, getting them into the community. You had a great idea, Mass said you had a great idea about it. So, what do you do to get people into the gun world who may not be on our side to start with?
Well, what Matt said during the break was when I was actively doing the ProArms podcast, I would have an occasional segment I like to call the ProArms broadcast. And that was where we threw out all the guys, and I just talked to women in the field. I had women trainers, women shooters, women competitors, women police officers, women publisher. So we just kind of talk about guns. And we've had some kind of round table bitching sessions, which have been awesome. So my plan with that was that, the guys were always saying, how can I get my wife to shoot? How can I get my mom or my girlfriend to shoot? The plan was to get the podcast, download it, trap them in the car and play the podcast, like nothing's going on, and they'll start to listen to it, kind of desensitize them a little bit. Listen to a bunch of normal women talk about shooting. We're not Rambet, we're just a bunch of normal females, and moms and grandmas and whatever. There's a lot more women out there podcasting now. You can hear them on your show, you can hear them on Ballistic Radio.
New Shooter Canada.
Slamfire. What's that one?
Andy and Julie.
Women carry. So there's a bunch of them. So just let them. It's kind of like normalizing it, If they don't think it's just an old boys club, it's kind of normal. There's women out there having a good time shooting. There's all these new women's groups out there. A few years they've been going on. A Girl in the Gun, we're pretty familiar with. There's also the Well Armed Woman. There's a bunch of other ones that I'm not real familiar with that have popped up. And they're kind of social groups. Massa spoke to the Well Armed Woman chapter of Micanopy a couple of times. And those women there, they range from their 20s to their 70s. And they're a fun bunch. She's got a bunch of them. Michelle Pickett down there at Pickett Weaponry. And they meet every month, and they have a great time. They talk, they learn, they shoot. It's a real bonding experience. It's a great group. It's a great thing for women to do. If, some women don't like to go out to the range with all the guys, that's a great alternative. Find other women who are interested in the same topic.
It's often said that women are the fastest growing segment of the shooting community. And I can see it myself. I've hosted Kathy Jackson up here 2 years, and the response that we've had up in Sioux Falls, I didn't know there were so many women that shot up here, let alone wanted training, and so it's been phenomenal. One thing I want to bring up real quick, and speaking of we want to be careful because I know Kathy occasionally listens. But I've gotten into trouble with Kathy Jackson before because I say, when I first met her, I said, well, women are naturally better shooters. She goes, no, that women don't come in to the shooting preconceived with, I've been shooting since I was 6. I know what I'm doing. They don't have many bad habits.
Oh,
to
yeah.
break.
Men think they came out of the womb knowing how to shoot.
And so,
And women are eager to learn. They want to learn. So
And
when you want to learn, you will listen and you will learn. A lot of men think they know it all already, and, what's this little lady going to teach me kind of thing. And when you have a closed mind, you're not open to new ideas and teaching, you're not going to learn.
Yeah, and women want to learn to do it the right way. So they
Yeah.
really want that instruction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Clayton, I think you had another question you wanted to ask again, right? Now realize you're in bonus area here.
Clayton again?
I have a surplus of questions, but I could pick one to say on the air. I have a gear question for Mass. He gave us a really good talk on the range about the philosophy behind Serpa holsters, where a lot of people have been negligently using them, shooting themselves in the leg, and a lot of instructors have taken the easy way out and just banned them from their ranges. I was wondering if you could share with us your philosophy on those.
We have not banned them. It strikes me as more a software issue than hardware. For any of your listeners not familiar with it, the Serpa was originally introduced by Blackhawk. There are now several copies. And basically, it's a lower level security holster that locks in on the front of the trigger guard on the inside of the holster, and it's released by a paddle button on the outside. It's released by the trigger finger. Now, where we're seeing problems with it, we Americans are called the push-button society. It's how we adjust our car radio, it's how we bring the elevator, et cetera, et cetera. And when we think push-button, we think pushing straight forward with the tip of the finger. Well, of course, if you do that in the holster, the trigger, the finger is now poised to enter the trigger guard. As the pistol is emerging from the holster, there is no longer anything to shield the trigger from the finger. The trigger finger snaps into the guard and contacts the trigger prematurely, and we're on the slippery slope. So I simply tell people, use it the way it's meant to be used, with a straight finger. And the easy way to remember it, what I tell my students, and I suggest others tell theirs, is fingerprint, not fingertip. If they remember to press as if they were applying for their carry permit or their driver's license and being fingerprinted, if the whole fingerprint is pressing, it guarantees the finger stays straight until the gun is cleared, until it's on target, and the shooter has intentionally brought the finger into the guard.
You mean like how you unlock your iPhone?
I vaguely remember you showing me something like that, but fortunately, Gail, I have the techno chick to do that for me.
Just saying.
Did you have a follow-up you wanted to?
No, it's good.
Matt, everybody, and I don't even know if you've been on mic yet, but Matt Martin from Geeks, Gadgets, and Guns, of course, is taking the Mag 40 as well. You had a question you wanted to bring up, right?
Yes, Mass. Throughout this class, I have found it phenomenal how much technology and knowledge you have about where gun designs came from and malfunctions caused by people not remembering where the designer originated. What do you find are some of the greatest mistakes we make because we are using guns in a way they were not designed to be used?
I think probably from a safety function, we tell people Colonel Cooper's Rule 2, Rule 3, keep the finger outside the trigger guard until you're ready to shoot. And in retrospect, 50 years later, maybe we need to rephrase that. To me, when I put the gun on in the morning, I think I damn well better be ready to shoot, or I don't have the mindset to be carrying one. So we try to make it a little more precise. The finger is not going to be in that trigger guard until you are in the very act of intentionally discharging the weapon. Once the last shot you intend to fire is done, I want to see that finger out of that guard like it was on a spring load before the gun even breaks the plane of the target and starts coming back down. With the semi-automatic pistol, almost since its inception, we've been taught the overhand method of grasping the slide. Some call it the GI method, the American method. The saddle method is the term my colleague Dave Spalding uses, because with the thumb toward the shooter, the support hand rides atop the slide like a saddle on the back of the horse. And the problem with that is, unless we're consciously keeping the gun muzzle straight down range, because the arms are forming an L, the forearms are forming an L, as we drive the slide rearward, the body wants, for mechanical advantage, to get both arms going in the same direction. So now we have the gun starting to drift toward the weak hand side, the muzzle points at the shooter's own forearm, and occasionally you'll see people pull it into their center instinctively for more strength. And they're literally pointing the gun at their own abdomen. It's one reason we recommend, we don't require, but we strongly recommend the Israeli method. Now, when I say Israeli method, I don't mean carrying every auto pistol with an empty chamber. I mean, activate the slide the way the Israelis are taught. The thumb of the support hand is forward toward the target, and that keeps the muzzle straight down range. And it's, in my opinion, a safer technique. It also prevents something we see with the overhand, where if you have, let's say, the M9 service pistol with the slide-mounted wing-style safety decocker, typically the thumb and the forefinger will press that down into the safe position, and when the shooter comes back up expecting a shot, they have a dead trigger. The way the hand grasps in the Israeli technique, it tends to pin that lever where it was. If you were on safe when you started, you stay on safe. And more important in a fight, if you are off safe, you stay off safe. And it keeps that potentially dangerous human error from occurring.
Oh, thank you. Out of curiosity, is there any developments that are currently occurring in the gun industry that you are excited to see where they're going to go?
They always are, but until they turn from vaporware to hardware, I reserve comment.
Introduce yourself and go ahead.
Oh, hi, I'm Heinrich on the Geeks, Gadgets, and Guns podcast. I was wondering what your opinions are on pistol caliber carbines.
What's not to like?
I don't personally own one, but I have shot them, and I think they are a really good solution for a problem that doesn't exist. For a survivalist type thing, for a prepper, they are great because you can have one magazine, one kind of ammunition that works in two firearms. I do like, for example, the I'm trying to think of the Just Right carbines. They make a very, very good one. But personally, if I'm going to buy a rifle, I'm going to buy a rifle in a rifle caliber that does rifle things. 357 is the lever action 357s come close to doing what rifles can do out at distance. But for me personally, and I'm probably going to get smacked down in about 10 seconds, but for me personally, if I'm going to buy a rifle, I'm going to buy a rifle. If I'm going to buy a handgun, I'm going to buy a handgun.
Well, I kind of like commonality, so I like them. I kind of like to have as many of the same thing. You know, if they all take 9mm, they all take 9mm. So we have one we've been testing that takes Glock magazines, 9mm Glock magazines, and I think that's awesome because my Glocks take 9mm Glock magazines. So I'm a big fan of them. Of course, I don't hunt either, so that could be a factor.
The gun Gail's talking about is the Tresna, Tresna JAG9. Very, very slick little gun. And you put the 33-round Gen 4 Glock mag in it, the thing is a hoot. What we found with it, you certainly don't get the power of the 223. You also do not get the deafening blast, particularly indoors in a home defense weapon. You have all the advantages of the telescoping stock of the AR platform. The recoil of the 9mm in that platform is essentially the same as a 223, and either of them is kind of like a loud 22, frankly. And if you've got folks in the family who are sensitive to noise, folks who are sensitive to recoil, it's really, I think, has a niche there, particularly for old arthritic folks and some. If you get a little old granny lady with osteoporosis, she's probably going to handle that 9mm carbine a whole lot better than she'll handle a pistol. And with the third locking point on the shoulder, there's no question the pistol caliber carbine is going to hit a lot more targets center and faster than they're going to hit the same shooter is going to hit with a pistol. Depending on the load you've chosen, you can get 9mm up in a 38 super territory. The 40 S&W carbine generally is equaling at the muzzle about what you get with a hot 10mm pistol, but in a much more manageable platform.
Cool. I can edit this out in case you don't want to talk about this, but something got brought up earlier that I just realized would be great for putting on the air, I hope. We've been noticing a big increase in the use of suppressors, and they're nationwide. There's even talk of possibly taking them off the Class 3 ATF site, and I hope that happens. I think it should. Has there been a instance, Mass, that you're aware of where there's been a suppressor used in a defensive shooting?
Not that I know of, but that doesn't mean it hasn't happened. That said, it's only a matter of time. Suppressor use is increasing almost exponentially now in the United States, and it makes huge sense when you're indoors defending your family to have a defensive firearm that's not going to deafen you, stun out one of your primary sensory acquisitions at the time you most need it, and possibly leave you with some permanent hearing impairment. So I think they are certainly going to be logically defensible. What we've seen in the past with privately owned legal Class 3 have all involved fully automatic weapons. And it seems that's just, like candy to prosecutors, particularly if they're anti-gun prosecutors, because, oh my God, who but Al Capone or a cocaine cowboy would want a machine gun? And seeing the way they've demonized the use of the semi-auto so-called assault rifle, you know where they're going with full auto and suppressors. That said, by and large, our side is winning those things when they go to court. I expect the same to happen with the suppressor. It is absolutely as explainable to a jury of 12 ordinary people as it was explainable to all the legislators who in the last few years at state level have legalized suppressors. So I think it's going to happen. I'm pretty confident that it's going to come out the right way for the law-abiding, licensed armed citizen who uses one.
Mass, another point is there's been lately a lot more trouble with old school firing ranges where suburbs have grown up around the firing ranges, and the people move in next to a range, and then before you know it, they start complaining that the range is making a lot of noise. If more people were able to get silencers, I like to call them silencers, call them what they are, there might be a lot less of those complaints.
I would agree with that, and there's historical precedent. We all know how rigid the gun laws have been over the years and over the decades, really, since early 20th century in England. What shocked me when I first went shooting in England in 1979 was you could walk into a sporting goods store and buy a suppressor the way we would buy a muffler at Midas Muffler. In fact, in England, they're called mufflers.
Well, that's what they are.
And it's considered the gentlemanly thing to do if you're going to shoot rabbits or do informal target practice on your property, to suppress the sound so you don't bother the neighbors, for the same reason you have a muffler on your car instead of a glass pack. So I think we've got real historic precedent here to change public opinion on that.
So you think they were just demonized back in the 20s by the gangsters using them on the Tommy guns, just like the anti-gunners now demonize the AR back in the Clinton days? Kind of demonized something that really didn't make sense demonizing. There's no reason why you need to buy a $200 stamp to own a silencer.
Sure. Our opponents demonize everything. Your ordinary Elmer Fudd telescopic-sighted deer rifle, they stigmatize as the sniper rifle of the assassin.
Right.
And we're never going to change their minds. What we have to do is bring logic to the great majority of people in the middle between the two poles of this polarized debate.
Well, I could definitely say that things are changing because video games have brought my generation, the younger generation, we've been exposed in these video games with guns that have suppressors, guns that are full auto. And honestly, whenever I talk to somebody my age, that's the guns they want to try. They are interested in it. And they find out, wait, they're how much money? That's ridiculous. It doesn't cost that much to manufacture it. It's the artificial limitation. We want to buy those. We want to try them. We want to have fun. Because we want to see how close this is to the game we've been playing for the last 10, 15, 20 years.
You guys want to shoot those Call of Duty guns.
Of course. And honestly, the turning point was when video games started representing current warfare, current weaponry, instead of just, hey, we're going to do World War II reenactments. It's when they started doing with like Call of Duty Modern Warfare, where they brought modern weapons in, the interest exploded. Even though they didn't really do much to make the games better, they kept getting bought year after year after year with very little changes to it, because that's where the interest is in the market.
And I think a lot of that's what's fueling what's called gun culture 2.0.
Oh, I can promise you that, because I'm one of them.
We noticed.
We are once again running up on the end of the break. Again, I've said it before, I'm going to say it again. Thank you both for coming, and thank you for both for taking now extra time to come and sit on the show. And folks, this time really we are going to be going to break. When we come back, there will be DGUs, and we will be back with those right after this.
In that case, Gail and I will leave before the shooting starts.
Yeah, really. That's what I was thinking.